From vaudeville to the silver screen to the small screen, the Marx Brothers made an impact wherever people found them. Now, Tom Fox and Mike Volkov bring them into the boardroom to help explain and explore the sometimes chaotic world of governance, risk management, ethics, and compliance. This is Why a Duck? Into the Compliance Soup, which is part of the Compliance Podcast Network.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. This is going to be a little bit different series this time on Why a Duck. We are going to dispense with a discussion of the Marx Brothers movie and have a 5-part series on COVID-19 and the role of compliance. We're going to take a look at various angles and perspective, including the board of directors, the CCO, ethical companies, new laws and regulations, crisis management, and leadership. Mike and I have written extensively on this subject, and we've linked to all of our posts and podcasts in the show notes, so I hope you will check those out for additional resources. In this part 1, we consider why business ethics matters even more now during the COVID-19 crisis. Hello, everyone. Tom Fox and Mike Volkov for our part 1 of our 5-part series on COVID-19 and compliance. Today, we're going to take up business ethics matters even more now. Mike, you wrote on this, and you really took business to task. And I wanted to maybe start with, do you think this starts with the top, and where do you see it going from there?
Well, it definitely starts from the top. There are 2 things that businesses have to do right off the bat, and that is, one, leadership has to express empathy. There has to be some recognition of the impact that this is having on people, not just by working at home, but I'm talking about families. Everybody knows somebody who's been affected by this pandemic or who has gotten sick, unfortunately. So empathy. But to me, the second point is that ethical leadership and your ethical values are even more important during this time because people are desperate for leadership. We have a vacuum of leadership at the federal level right now. That's why Andrew Cuomo's, daily briefings, people are gravitating to them because they are leadership, but it's obviously focused on one state. But he's demonstrating what leadership is about. If you watch his messages, there's transparency, truthfulness, recognition of problems, and also empathy. He had his daughters there. He talked about the impact on their lives of going through this. That's what leadership is. And right now with ethics, everything obviously has been turned on its head. The number one issue, and I think you would relate to this, Tom, in terms of sort of the oil industry or any industry where the first and most important thing is safety and health of your employees. And here we have safety and health during a pandemic, which has to be the first consideration where ethical values come into play. Where I think the interesting issue plays out is depending on what industry you're in. What if you're in one of my clients' stock is skyrocketing right now because their business relates to treatment of people with the virus as well as other problems. So that's a business that right now, the more they produce, the better for overall society. Now, they may come across times when production costs may exceed the investment value or the immediate returns, but yet they do have, I think, a responsibility to to the society and to the public at large. So now we're seeing the analysis we go through all the time of looking at key stakeholders. Here, the key stakeholders are safety and health of our employees, but also the public welfare, the protection of our welfare. And I think that creates a whole new set of values that have to be put into place. You're a restaurant owner and you can only provide takeout food services, so you need a scaled back number of employees. But what should you do? Should you furlough 10 people or keep 10 people on part-time? That's sort of a lot of questions that everybody's coming up with, and we have to look at this as this is not going to, be a forever situation. It may take a year to 2 years to recover, but we have to make decisions in this new context. And I find it really challenging and fascinating.
So, Mike, I really like the way you laid out how a business should think through this, both in looking at key stakeholders and assessing their interests, but also assessing the risks and assessing the risks in this environment. Because what your risks were 3 weeks ago may be materially changed now. And that those risks obviously could be safety and health risks, but they could also be data privacy, data protection risks. It could be additional risks around legal violations. It could be risks around corporate succession planning if you have not engaged in that and you have senior executives or even board of directors who've potentially been exposed to COVID-19. And so the risks need to be assessed, and that assessment needs to be updated. And you may actually have to do that on a, if not day-by-day basis, a week-by-week basis, so that you can roll that information up to your decision makers, who then have to overlay this ethical business decision framework that you've talked about in terms of your employees, number one, and secondary stakeholder issues, number two. In this podcast series, we're going to get into some of the tactical steps that can be taken. But I think you've really hit on something here, which is the framework by which business ethics decisions need to be made. And that reemphasizing at the top of the organization that we'll assess our problems, but we're going to overlay ethical business decision making is going to be critical. And it's going to be critical, I think, not only for these times, these weeks, these next 30, 60, 90 days, however long we are in this direct crisis, but then when you come out, I think as a business, you're going to be judged on your ethical decision making during this time of crisis. If it's true that crisis really only demonstrates who you were already, I think customers, shareholders, local communities, third parties, and other stakeholders will view you on how you did not engage in ethical business decision making during the height of this crisis, and what you did for the key stakeholders that you have talked about.
Tom, it's well said. And, look, the framework that I'm suggesting is we start with, health and safety of our employees and stakeholders. Can we continue our business? What's our business continuity? And I know we'll talk about this later when we get to governance. And then the impact on the business and employees from, curtailing or cutting back, and also what's going on in the overall economy. And then we look at our stakeholders, the common ones. We have an obligation to our shareholders, but we have an obligation to the public, to our communities, and we have an obligation also to work with the government in terms of, to the extent our government needs our assistance or we can, facilitate that. I think all those interests of stakeholders have changed radically in terms of how we assess it. And then, not to, exaggerate the point, but things are changing, day to day. These models and projections on all of this, they're not reliable yet. They're model assumptions, and they change, depending on which model. We have a model of 100,000 to 240,000, but there's no transparency as to the assumptions or that model, what went into the calculation of that model, and other epidemiologists are disputing that. So these are all things that your crisis management team, which we'll talk about in another episode, has to be aware of on a daily basis. And so the first thing, though, is to start with your ethical values and the principles, because you're exactly right. If you don't stick to them, if you don't apply them at this point, then 6 months from now, the public and your stakeholders are going to ask, why didn't you adhere to those principles? They obviously didn't mean anything, or they were just paper principles and were not part of your culture. So everybody is going to be judged, from the federal government, from the president, from state governments, from everybody who was involved in this and implicated in it, in terms of planning responsibilities and protecting the American public. I mean, that's in the end what the Constitution gives our federal government the responsibility to protect our general welfare. And here we've had a dramatic letdown in that, and that's made company values and performance and actions even more important in the absence of federal leadership.
Mike, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode, but I hope our listeners will join us for part 2, where we take up boards of directors and crisis management. I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Why a Duck. Make sure to subscribe, and if you enjoyed the episode, leave a review.